A way to structure this initial conversation is to look at that MOU, or the Memorandum of Understanding that I shared with you all a couple of weeks ago, and to sort of structure a conversation around that and make really clear goals and tasks for each group. And it's good to have that actual document in place before you start working. So these are the goals that were established for the UW Archives workshop. And this was the outcome of 2 probably hour-long conversations that I had with Kat about what kind of collection would work well, what kind of space we would have, how many volunteers we would have space for, and what would be reasonable in the scope of doing this CAW as part of the training of the trainers workshop. So our first goal is to briefly inspect, rehouse, label, and inventory one 60mm film collection, and that has about 90 items in it. And then Kat is still working on she would like us to work on a second collection as well of a different format. So either audio, I think it would be like reel-to-reel audio, or some sort of video format. And she's really looking through her collections to find a concise enough collection that we could get through the whole thing in the scope of that 6-hour workshop, and also something that's useful for the volunteers she has bringing in. So we have volunteers from the UW Library. So she's looking specifically for a collection that really does document the university community. So people who work in the library system might make connections between other collections that they have at their own libraries or archives. So that's our first goal, is to just get through the collections. And we want to collect that data into a spreadsheet. And I'll talk more about that spreadsheet and how we've come up with the fields in that spreadsheet later. We're also going to attempt to do basic appraisal research on film titles. And this would be to help Kat and the UW Archives understand what items in this specific film collection we're looking at are unique and which ones exist at other libraries. And we'll go over how we're going to do this appraisal research. And basically it's looking in WorldCat for titles and documenting how many other institutions hold this item, what format it's in, just so UW Archives can understand if they want to keep that material or if they are responsible for preserving it. And then finally, we want to prioritize the most at-risk valuable titles from the collections we're working on for reformatting. And part of the reason that that is one of our goals is because there is a digitization stipend that the UW Archives will receive, just like you all will receive for your workshops as well, to reformat some material. So we would like to be able to prioritize that list as part of the workshop goals. And that's part of the reason we'll be doing some of that appraisal research to determine which titles actually should be reformatted for access. So that's what we agreed on. And here's how we sort of broke out the tasks. So on the left side here, we have the tasks that the trainers, so myself and Jeff, are responsible for, as well as Recollection Wisconsin, in terms of setting up the workshop. So we will prepare some presentations, which will be part of the CAW, and orient people to the collections we're working on, the type of work we'll be doing that day. We will bring inspection kits and equipment, which will help us do our inventories. And we have a specific film inspection kit that was built as part of this grant that will live in Madison and be distributed by Recollection Wisconsin throughout the state for people who need it. So we'll bring that to the CAW. We will also provide ongoing support for digitization and access of the collections, and we will provide the refreshments. And the UW Archives is providing the collections. They will be responsible for doing a presentation on the specific collections we're working on to all the volunteers and participants. They are ordering rehousing supplies in advance. They're taking care of finding the space and making sure it has projection equipment for our presentations. And they are the ones who recruiting volunteers for the event. So these are the items we've all agreed on in advance. And I'd say we agreed on all of this stuff about 2 months in advance, 2.5 months in advance of the workshop. We started conversations about this, even though most of the work didn't have to be done right away. We had a few conversations preparing. So one of the big tasks, of course, is to get volunteers to come and help at the workshop. And this is one that the UW Archives, in our case, has taken on. So they decided that because of the nature of the collections, which document the university, the history of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, it made a lot of sense to invite volunteers from the library community. And that includes current library staff from other libraries on campus that might not have a lot of AV experience. They also have invited volunteers from the Friends of the Library group, which consists of a lot of it. I believe that the Friends of the Library group is partly made up of retired library staff, also just retired faculty who are interested in the library. So people who have already have an interest in the library collections. So really they used existing resources to find their volunteers. They used listservs that they already had. And rather than reaching outside of the community, which they certainly could have. But I think Kat recognized the constraints of trying to recruit volunteers, and especially there's some restraints in terms of like, there's not a lot of parking on campus. So if they were to recruit people from communities outside of, in other parts of Madison, it would be logistically a little more difficult. So being realistic about what the practicalities of the situation is really important. And she also didn't have a lot of time to recruit volunteers. She recruited about 5 weeks ago, I think. And you want to give people a heads up, like you want to start recruiting about a month in advance, so people can get it on their calendars. You're asking a full day's work basically from people. So, and it's happening on a weekday. So it was the UW Archives goal or task to get the volunteers. And as one of the organizers, I will provide Kat with a volunteer packet to distribute to her volunteers about 2 weeks in advance. So she'll be getting that at the end of the week to distribute to her volunteers. Yeah, so I think that's everything about volunteers. So I want to just stop here to see if anyone has any questions, particularly about working with outside groups and partnering, about the memorandum of understanding, or any other questions or comments. We'll just take a little breather here if anyone has anything. No, that's it. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
So I was just wondering, when choosing a collection, I understand the Madison one had about 90 in their first one, and then they're going to be looking at another collection. Are you, do you have a specific amount or a general amount?
Yeah, yes, we have come up with a good amount. So 100 to 200 items.
Okay, that's helpful. Perfect.
Is about what is realistic. And
okay, thank you.
I'll go more into that too, about what makes a good collection.
Okay.
But you do want to try to, I mean, for everyone's, it feels good to finish the task you're working on. So it's good to pick an amount that you think you might be able to get through, even though of course it's okay if you don't get through everything. Mm-hmm. But it also helps people feel like they can work at a reasonable pace. You don't want people rushing through anything. So 100 to 200 items.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? We'll have a few other points in the webinar today where we'll stop for questions. So if you think of something else, just hold on to it for a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to move on to a few more of the pre-CAW tasks. So one of the big ones, of course, that you need to figure out in advance is the data template. So what kind of information do you want the volunteers to be gathering? And if you are working on your own collection, this is a bit easier because you'll be very familiar with what kind of data you need, what kind of databases you're already working with. If you're working with a partner, it's really important to gather this information from them very far in advance to make sure that what they're asking for in terms of what metadata you're going to gather is actually possible. Like, for instance, you might not be able to watch AV material or listen to it during a workshop. So you're obviously not going to be able to then get content metadata from other than from what's written on the cases or on the outside of the containers. So you want to be realistic about what you're actually able to gather. We're just looking at a sample template that one of the partners for the California workshop had. And in terms of the example of what Kat and I are working on now for the data template for our workshop, Kat is still thinking about it, basically, because they're in the process of switching to a new system. So and they're not quite in that new system yet. So she wants to see what fields are going to be available once that system gets set up. And we will not be entering data directly into her database. What we'll do is enter things into a Google Sheet, so an Excel type of spreadsheet, and we'll set it up in a way where the fields match whatever she needs to import into. And that's basically what you want to be thinking about is what are the fields you need, which fields are possible for volunteers to gather for you by looking at the objects, and you want it to be formatted in a way that works for your system, and then you want it to be able to be easily ingested back into your system if you have one. In a lot of cases with these workshops, we're working with partners who don't have any database. So we're helping them set up an inventory system on a spreadsheet. And we have templates available for that. So you might not be working with your own collection, you might not have a template or a database set up for AV material, but we can help you build that to help you get some just basic information. And maybe in the future, you'll have a database that you can ingest that into. But we go back to this idea of like meeting people where they are, and that's something very particular to the template. There's lots of best practices about what kind of metadata you should be capturing for AV, but we don't need to capture all of it for every collection. So this is a very important conversation to have either with your internal planning committee or with the organizer and the collection partner you're working with. And on the Wednesday, the first day of our in-person training, we're going to be going over the template that we'll use on Thursday for the community archiving workshop with Kat, and we'll have a conversation about how we came to that template. So there'll be more about that later. Another really important pre-CAW core task is planning the space, the equipment, the supplies. So making sure that, in particular for these workshops, it's really nice to have furniture you can move around and set up sort of like pods for different groups of people to be at. Another really important thing that seems silly to spend so much time thinking about, but it's so important, is like, where are you going to eat? Because you don't necessarily want to be eating at the same tables where you have collection materials sitting out. So planning those types of things in advance, making sure you have enough power. So if you need extension cords, or if everyone's going to have a laptop, you want to make sure that they can plug them in if they need to. Do you need thumb drives? Do you have good wireless? All of these, a lot of the space constraints will determine your workflow. For instance, if the Wi-Fi is not good, you don't want to all be using Google Sheets because it'll cause a lot of problems if the Wi-Fi is going in and out throughout the day. Or if people need special logins to get into the Wi-Fi in your space, you just want to make sure you have that ready. So it's good to talk through all of this. Again, it's a basic event planning point, but there might be specific equipment you need for your workshop. So, and laptops are really important. And I'll just say here that we will ask if people have them, that you bring your own laptops to the workshop, to the day of the call. Kat has already planned to get a set of laptops from the library we'll be in, but just in case everyone doesn't have a laptop, we always try to ask people to bring laptops if they have them. Okay, on to our next pre-task. We want to compile resources for volunteers and send that out with reminders. One of the important resources are just like identification resources. So how can you tell different video formats apart? What are some basic facts about film collections? What are the different gauges? Resources with pictures are really important. And we have a big template for a resource pack, or for a volunteer packet already available that will be available to all of you for your own workshops. And you can remove material, like if you know you're just working on an audio collection, for instance, you could take the video section out of it and adapt it for your own needs. But these resources do already exist. And one of the reasons we send out this nice set of resources is because part of the reason we're bringing the volunteers in is just so they can feel more comfortable with AV materials. The whole point, remember, of like this whole workshop model is to just get people feeling comfortable with their own expertise on working with different kinds of materials. It seems like people have a particular anxiety around some AV materials, like they just feel like they don't know what to do, and we really want to demystify it. So that's one of the reasons we send out the resources, just so people have some ways to learn on their own, either before or after the workshop. Okay, so that's a pre-CAW core task. And just to sort of go over what we've just talked about. So the first thing we're doing is agreeing on a collection. And like you can see from the picture, you don't want to pick too many things because it'll freak everyone out. So agree on a reasonable collection and scope. And we'll talk more about what makes a reasonable collection. But generally, you want to work on 1 or 2 collections in the archival sense of the word. So it's good if the materials go together and provide context for each other. And you don't want to pick too much stuff. Okay. And then you want to establish your tasks. So here's another example of a collection that's being, here, let's see. I'm a little bit lost. Okay, so still talking about the collection, sorry. So at UW Archives, we're working on the BAVI film collection. So that's BAVI stands for the Bureau of Audiovisual Instruction. So that was the University of Wisconsin's basically film lab. They made educational films for campus. I think for the whole university system, they made educational films. But they also bought films that were produced elsewhere and distributed them. So this is a specific UW collection, but it might have some redundant material in it that's available elsewhere. The subset of the collection that we're working on for our workshop are just the completely unprocessed titles. So we're not working on the entire collection, we're just working on a subset. And we will pre-sort that material so we can see right away if there's duplicate material in that collection. So there might be 3 copies of one film, and we'll want to make sure that those are all together before we start inventorying them, because it might be an opportunity for us to identify which one is in the best shape. So since the UW Archives will probably not keep 3 copies of a single title. Okay, so after we've figured out our collection, our scope, we have a partner, we need to decide on the details of the workflow. So it's something to talk about the day before, but it's also very common for the workflow to change the day of or the day before, because you see the space, you put the stuff in the space and you're like, oh, that's not going to work. This is how we need to do it. So the workflow can be sort of nebulous for a while until you're actually in the space with the collections. And this is not uncommon. It's part of the adaptability and flexibility of this. And any of you who have processed an archival collection know, like, you have an idea of what it is, and then you start opening the boxes and you find surprises, you find things you weren't thinking of. And that's kind of what happens with this workflow, is like, you're like, oh, we thought it was all this, but there's a different format in here as well. So that will be a separate step or something like that. So that's why you want to be nimble about this, but you do need to think about it beforehand. And different options for the workflow, for instance, will each volunteer take each item through an entire workflow? That's one option. So there's one box, each person gets a box of stuff. They do the data entry, they do the rehousing and the labeling, and they put a barcode on it and it's done. And then they put it back in the box. Or do you want to separate out those steps? Do you want to have the inspection being done at one table because it has special equipment, and then the material gets passed to the next table for rehousing and labeling? So those are things to think about, just how the workflow is going to be broken down. And that really does need to be decided before your volunteers get there, because it will determine how you explain the process, where they'll actually be sitting, what they'll be doing. And here's where we talk about the core tasks. So this is what you guys were thinking about as part of your homework, and sort of what role you want to practice during our CAW in Madison. So we have our planning committee. So for Madison, the planning committee is already in place. Me and Kat are doing that, basically. So we've taken care of the logistics, the supplies, the outreach. We're working on the data template for the inventory inspection. But on the day of, we have some specific tasks that we want people to work on. And part of the logic for assigning these specific tasks is that there's going to be one or two people, and in this case, it'll be me and Jeff, probably, who are floaters and who are just answering questions, and who can't really be assigned a specific task because we'll just have to be running around and making sure everything's working right. And it's important then for the planners to delegate a lot of the other work to specific people. So a welcome table is really important to just orient your volunteers. If you like, give them a packet if they don't already have one. Assign them to specific tasks based on what they want to work on or what their expertise is. And then the table captains are sitting at the actual processing tables, and they're the ones who are coordinating the work at that table. So making sure that the data entry is going as it should be. They're the person who, if there's a major question that comes up, they should find the organizer and ask. The box table, this is something that may or may not be at any workshop. It depends on how the workflow is set up, but sometimes the collection is all sitting at one table, and then each processing table, so the table captains, the table that they're in charge of with the volunteers sitting at it, would just take one section of the collection at a time to work on. So everything is being monitored by the box table to make sure the collections are organized. They can check that things have been labeled properly after the inventory team is done with it. So that's something we may or may not have at our workshop. We'll decide when the workflow gets set up. And then finally, we need people to help with the presentations. So part of the beginning of the actual community archiving workshop, when the volunteers come in, we start with presentations. And it's usually about an hour of presentations. just welcoming people, explaining the concept of a community archiving workshop. Basically, it's the presentation that we did in the first webinar. So just like the philosophy, why we do it this way, how it can benefit us, etc. And then we do specific presentations, technical presentations about the formats of media in the collections we're working on that day. So what are the preservation concerns for magnetic media like videotape or audio tape? What should we be looking out for? What are the correct terminologies for the types of tape or the different formats? And how to specifically do the inspection and inventory that we're going to be working on right after the presentation start. So you want your main group of volunteers who are helping you plan the events. You want to assign some of these roles in advance. And you all will be taking on these roles during our workshop. So we're going to talk more about, at the end of the webinar, about those specific roles and who's going to be doing what. Another important pre-core task, we're almost done with the pre-core tasks, I promise. You want to do a site visit if you're working with an outside partner to actually look at the collection, see the space you're going to work in. It could be a virtual visit. It's really common to just get images of the collection emailed, or photos of the space emailed, so you can just start visualizing it and talking about it together. But if you can do an in-person site visit, that's great. You definitely want to do a site visit the day before the event, because during the day before, you could set up the room in advance. You could bring collections to the space in advance and do any triage or arrangement of the collections that will help your workflow work better. If you can't do it the day before, you can also do it in the morning before the event starts. So that's one of the reasons the event usually starts at around 11. It's so you can get there, at like 8 or 9 and make all these last minute decisions and set up the room if necessary. The pre-visit is also really important for making sure there's enough outlets, power strips, anything you might have forgotten about. Just give yourself a little bit of time to think about that stuff before your volunteers arrive. Okay, so that's the last of our pre-CAW tasks. And I'm going to hand it off to Jeff to talk about the day of tasks.
Right. And this is actually, in a sense, kind of a recap of what Amy's already been talking about, because this is sort of what the workflow will be like on the day. Like Amy said, it's critical to get into the space and get it set up as early as possible. And if you've done a site visit and you know that everything will be ready the day before, that might mean you need only an hour before you start, and that's how that can determine what time of day you start. Obviously, you're limited by access hours at a particular location, but you do want to get there as early as possible and get everything fully set up according to the workflow that you've already worked out. And I mean, in this case, we see just the beginning of that, of one of the inspection tables where things are just starting to get laid out properly. And if we take a look at move on to the next slide, Amy. The welcoming and orienting volunteers is, again, it's very straightforward, but it's very critical. It's really helpful to know as much as you can about who your volunteers are. You may be in a position to be able to say, such and such person should do this, such and such person should be doing this. But in some cases, you simply have to help assign people to tasks that then the table captains or you or one of the other volunteers will instruct them in. You may get people who really don't know what they have to offer, or may know nothing about audiovisual archiving at all. And so this is the point at which you sort of orient and welcome and guide them, make sure they know the schedule for the day, what their responsibilities would be, and where to go with questions. That's especially important. On the next slide, this is where the presentations come in. And as Amy said, there's 3 or 4, depending on, 3 or two, depending. You can modify them, tweak them, depending on what the collections are like. There's the basic one, which again is essentially a shorter version of the webinar we had the other day. But if we look at the next slide, this is one of the sample slides from the Video Basics presentation. And these are, in a sense, they're relatively straightforward. They're designed for people without a background in media preservation. So, for example, the Video Basics takes people through the history of different videotape formats and how they've changed over time and what some of the types of vulnerabilities are. Next slide is another one from Video Basics, where you can explain to people the physical composition of magnetic media. This is all information that people will find helpful to varying degrees on the day, but in the longer term, I think it's educational for people who may be continuing to work with the collection in particular to know as much about the material they're handling as possible. Like Amy said, this is a lot about demystification, and these presentations are designed to do that. And I think we have one more slide from Video Basics, Amy, is that right? Yeah, well, this is Audio Basics, and explains how audio is laid out on a tape. Again, another way of helping people understand what they're actually looking at. I mean, everybody's looked at an audio cassette probably before, but the actual way that the tape is laid out and how the audio appears on the tape is something that's important to understand for preservation, and something these presentations are designed to do. And I think the next one, Amy, is also about video and showing what actually is on a videotape. And one of the things we talk about in video preservation is how the edges are extremely vulnerable to damage, and if they're damaged heavily, then the videotape can have serious problems. And that's because, for example, like here, the control track is along the edge of the tape, and that's what controls the actual playback in proper synchronization. And again, so this is the gist of some of the information that's in these presentations. And they're designed to be very straightforward. They have, they'll have detailed presenters' notes, so they can be done essentially as a lecture. And on the day, coming up, Amy and I will certainly be there to answer questions that may arise that are a little bit outside the area of expertise that's given through the presentations. And I think that's it, the gist of it for the presentations. Am I right about that, Amy?
Yep.
Yeah. Again, they're designed to be user-friendly, and if, to give the presenter enough information to get through them in an efficient way, without having to, have a deep knowledge of the material. And they've been used before, so they've sort of been tested over time.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just add that the templates are available to you for your own workshops.
Mm-hmm.
You can modify them,
Right.
They're really you don't have to come up with any of this stuff from scratch when you do your own workshops.
Right. Yeah. If for example, you have video and film, but you want to compress, sometimes you look at these presentations and you may feel it's a little bit overly technical, that some of it's not necessary. They're free to be modified, whatever you need, but they're available. I think they're very helpful. Mm-hmm. So next slide is the big part, which is the inspection and inventory. And really, this is the process that Amy has laid out in talking about getting the call organized, is that it's about the physical inspection, which, the introductory presentations will help people know how to do. And the table captains will be the people in charge of making sure that things are properly inventoried. This also includes, things like sometimes repairing housing, sometimes doing cleaning. A lot of times things are very dusty, so you may want to have things like tack rags. But this is the heart of the process. And it's, in a sense, is really the simplest part of the process. It's you've developed all the tools that you need to enter the material into the relevant Google Sheet or other form. You've given people the knowledge they need to be able to inspect and identify materials. You made decisions about what information you want to capture from those materials. And this is a matter of just actually doing the work. So it's funny that this is the bulk of the day, but it's covered in one slide because in a sense, it's the most straightforward part of the day. I mean, do you think that's a fair characterization, Amy? That's how I feel about it. Is like once you've done all of this planning work, the sitting down and going through is straightforward, but that's why you have sort of roving people like Amy and I who will be available to just sort of do whatever needs to be done. You know, running out of labels, running out of tape, running out of something, confusion about names, things like that. You know, do you need to search? Does somebody need to like Google search a name to try to make sure the spelling is proper, etc.
Right. I'll just add one thing here, Jeff, based on pictures that we're looking at, which when we were talking about volunteers and like assigning people to tasks, I didn't talk about this, but it can be really important, is if you have as your group of volunteers, some people with more expertise and some people just really with no expertise at all, it's really common for the volunteers to be made up of some library archive professionals and then just people who are interested in the collection. It can be really important to mix those people up in the tables.
Yes, absolutely.
And people really train each other. And I'm just seeing the middle picture here. I see that happening. And on the right too, like there's people, one librarian archivist and one community volunteer. And so it's not like we're training everyone the whole day. It's like everyone's learning from each other.
Right. That's really critical. And it really helps engage. It's a community archiving workshop. And that's one of the great things about it is engaging people with the collection who otherwise would never have had the opportunity to do so. And it's really great. That's really the most enjoyable part of the whole thing. But really, I think we could step onto our next slide, which is the sort of end of day wrap up. And you really do need to make sure you've set aside the time during the day for this part of the process, which is to, wrap up the processing sufficiently so that everything is back in its proper place. You need to know going in, since taking one step back, it's an organizational thing. For example, if you want to do the call from 11 to 5, does that mean that the space needs to be like completely empty at 5? Or does that mean that you're wrapping up at 5 and can come back tomorrow and move things out to maximize the volunteers' time during the day? Either way, this is something you want to set aside time for, like a fixed time where you really do step back and summarize, as a group for the participants, for the, people who manage the collection. Okay, how much did the collection get done? How much did everybody achieve during the course of the call? And then talk about what the next steps are for the collection. The next slide, I think, is, the other thing you should leave time for is the evaluations. I think we all know that they're really important, but we also know that if you don't leave time for people to do them before they go home, you do not get the response that you get otherwise. So it's really helpful to leave that 10 or 15 minutes and build it in, to both, formally thank people, but also to get their feedback before they go on what the course of the day has been like for them. This is, the next slide has a pretty typical summary of the evaluations, and I think it shows how important it is to get this type of feedback. What did you learn? And I think that in and of itself is always fascinating to read. It's like, what did people actually learn? And it varies very widely, from CAW to CAW and from collection to collection. but I don't remember which CAW this is from. Sorry, excuse the phone. But to see that 79% of the participants had never done one before, and I think that's pretty typical. Wouldn't you say, Amy, that the majority of people, this is their first time doing this sort of thing?
Yeah.
Aside from the AMIA volunteers, and I think that's great. That's always a really positive thing to see.
Mm-hmm.
And really one of the core strengths of the whole thing, because again, it is bringing in people to get to know these collections and get to know, perhaps establish a relationship with a collection that they might not otherwise have. People who for example, like the retired librarians that are a part of a lot of these CAWs or local volunteers,
Mm-hmm.
to get them as part of the collection moving forward, not just on a single day.
Right.
And then the post-CAW tasks. Amy, would you like to take these ones, or did you want me to? Oh no, I'm continuing. I'm so sorry.
Continuing.
Okay, that's fine. You know how to, this stuff as well as I do. That's why I was asking. So post-CAW, there's first of all the task of merging all of the files, if that's necessary. If you've been using Google Sheets, that wouldn't be necessary. Sometimes in the past there have been laptops with different Excel spreadsheets that all had to be merged into a single document. And then it's a question of determining whose task it is. Well, this should have been determined, obviously, going in, to sort of write the summary of what was learned from the call, what's learned about the collection, and where it goes. And I think, you didn't talk about this one, actually, when we were preparing for this. We didn't talk about this specifically, but I think, planning on how you're reporting out is really something really important to do when the process is getting started. Thinking about who are you reporting to? Is it within the institution? Is this something you're trying to put together for a possible grant? Understanding what the final report on the project is going to look like. And, we can certainly talk about that in more detail. But I think going in with an understanding of what you want to come out with in terms of a report is really important and something to think about during the planning process. Do you think that's fair to say, Amy?
Yeah, I completely agree. It's something that can get easily forgotten about if it's not planned really well in advance, of just like, we really, like, especially if you're working with an outside partner, you don't want to just leave that institution with boxes of stuff and a spreadsheet that they don't understand that well. Like,
right.
You might need to interpret it together into a different sort of document, depending on what, like Jeff said, if the institution wants to write a grant, if they're trying to make an ask internally for more support for a collection, etc.
Yeah, I think in general, that is something that I would say you want to task one or more people with specifically, is generating a final report. And even if it's an internal only report, this may be an assessment that the organization isn't able to take any action on for a couple of years. And sometimes in small institutions or any institution, there's turnover in staff and people are looking at a spreadsheet only and feeling like they're a bit lost.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's something we've learned from the earliest CAWs, where we learned that we needed to step up and do more afterwards in terms of a report, and that the people organizing the CAW needed to take a more active role in that. But you really do need to think about getting not just numbers and counts, but some sort of written summary based on the needs of whatever the organization might be. And, again, something to task someone with and set a deadline for, so that it's done. And because after everybody goes home, you don't want to lose that momentum from the CAW itself. And then it's about developing the next strategies, using it as the next step is about using it to develop a preservation plan. And this is something, first of all, you will notice that this is a slightly modified version of one of the documents that was used in, I think, I forget where. Anyway, it's partly in Spanish. We strongly urge that part of the reporting out be looking at what the preservation plan is. Hopefully, as part of the process of doing the call and learning about the materials, you will have learned more about what a preservation plan looks like and what some preservation priorities would be like. And we have some tools and documents that we'll share as well. Right, Amy? That's part of sort of the information we're providing.
Yeah, and one of the things that we'll go over is which specific formats of video and audio and film are most at risk. So you can prioritize based on format as well as content. And of course,
Right.
You'll know more about the value of the content of your own collections.
Yeah.
We can help you with that technical part about the specific formats.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then, what's our next slide?
Oh, so we're getting close to the end, so
Yeah.
I can take over a little bit, Jeff, but please jump
okay.
in as needed.
Okay.
So we're going to talk a little bit more about these roles and how we envision our own workshop happening in Madison. So just to go over these again, we'll definitely need a greeter. We'll need some table captains. I think we'll hold off on the box table for now until we decide if we actually need that, which we'll know very soon. And then we'll need at least two brave people for presentations. I know we already have one volunteer. Thank you, Greg. So now, as we just have some time to talk about anything that went on in the webinar today, anything you've been thinking about since the first webinar. And in particular, I want to make sure that we have time to discuss which role you want to practice in the event in Madison, what you feel most comfortable with, and then thinking beyond that for your own event, ideas about who do you think you could recruit for volunteers for your event? What kind of community resources do you have available to you? What kind of expertise you could bring in if you feel like you need to have more audiovisual expertise for you to run your own event? And any questions you're having now about how the day will actually run. And of course, for your own event, we have lots of time to talk about this still, but if things are coming up now, it's a good time to talk about them. But first, let's start with which role you see yourself in during the event in Madison. And Greg already emailed me about presenting, and I believe that Crystal was interested in being a table captain. Is that right, Crystal?
Box table, actually.
Box table. Okay.
Thank you.
Do other people have ideas about what they feel comfortable with during what role you want to take on?
So Annika and I at the Milwaukee Public Museum are open to any of the roles that you have. So
Okay.
whatever the greatest need is.
Okay.
Do you have a preference? Did you say you had a preference?
No,
She did. She still didn't. Yeah, any of it.
Okay.
I don't think the presenting part would be your first choice, right?
I can if you need
She
it.
can do it, but okay.
Yeah, we definitely won't force anyone to do the presenting
Okay.
if they don't want to, because Jeff and I can definitely do those too. But if people want to practice that, this is a great opportunity, and we could give you the slide deck with really detailed notes that
Okay.
could basically just be practiced and read.
So Amy, you can just surprise us and just assign us to whatever you need.
Okay. Great.
This is Dustin. I'm here with Jan, and we feel the same way. You can just assign us to do something, but we'd prefer not to do the presentation.
Okay. Okay.
I'm a worker bee.
I mean, the table captains are that's the role that you'll learn a lot in, I think, in terms of seeing how the day works. And I'll also mention that if you guys want to float between tables to see like if different formats are being processed at different tables, we'd encourage you to like switch roles throughout the day. We've in the past during workshops had the volunteers actually we just say, okay, everyone switch tables now, because we want people to rotate around we've sort of moved away from being as formal about it and just let people do it as they want. Because I know I'm like this. Some people, you get really into a task and you just want to finish it. So I never liked switching tables. So we give people flexibility now. Sean, what about you? What do you feel like you'd want to help with?
Sean sent a message that his Bluetooth headset died.
Oh,
He's over
okay.
on group chat.
Oh, okay. I'm just seeing that now. Okay. Well, we'll check in with Sean during the in-person meeting to see what he's interested in. But yes, like I said, so the day before on our Wednesday of training, we're basically preparing for the next day for our workshop and talking in more detail about what the roles are. We're going to be going over in detail like the inventory process. So if you're still feeling like a little bit at sea about the process, or like feeling like you're not going to know enough to be able to take charge of the volunteers, I think you'll feel after we spend the day together on the first day of the in-person training, hopefully you'll feel more confident. And also just always remember that Jeff and I are there, and we'll also, and Kat from the UW Archives has the collection expertise as well as some audiovisual expertise, and we'll have other people with AV expertise on hand, locals. So you're not going to be responsible for like answering any question that you don't know the answer to. There's always resources. Yeah. So what about, does anyone else have any thoughts about your own events or any questions you're thinking of, or do you have ideas for who your group of volunteers might be?
I have a question. This is Greg.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just detail a little bit about what comes in the kits that Recollection Wisconsin will provide? I'm
Sure.
curious if it's, more than just inspecting, if there's basic cleaning supplies, what all is there really?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll explain. Yeah, we'll spend time with the kits in person as well. We'll get some practice with them. But the kit that we built specifically with the grant funding has is for film inspection. So it is a portable kit that you just set up on any table, and it has a set of rewinds, so you can actually unspool the film reels a bit safely to start looking at what the content is. And there's a light table, there are wipes, and I think there's not alcohol in the kit for cleaning because that's bad for shipping it. But but there's details on how, like what kind of alcohol to use to clean film. There are tape labels, loops, markers, like a big set of permanent markers, which are good for labeling any kind, not just for film, but also for video. Yeah, I think off the top of my head, there's also, as part of that kit, there's a small film digitization machine, which is good for access copies. It's not good for like super high quality digital reformatting, but there is a small film digitization kit, which will have instructions and you'll learn how to use it, and you'll be able to borrow that. So that's one of the kits. The other kits that are available have been put together by Dorothea Sallow at the UW Information School, and those are already available, and those are video digitization kits and audio digitization kits. I believe that they're for VHS and DV cam and mini DV, and audio cassettes and mini audio cassettes. And those are also available to borrow, and they're in like shippable kits. They're in like, I forget the name of it, Pelican cases. And they come with very detailed documentation and instructions. So those will be testing out. We won't necessarily be using the digitization kits during the community archiving workshop in Madison, but you might incorporate the digitization kits into a workshop that you guys decide to host. You can also just borrow them to work on materials outside of workshop use. You might just decide you want to have a staff member, an intern digitize some collections, so you borrow the kit for a month. And Recollection Wisconsin will be in charge of the loaning process for those, and Emily will talk, Emily or Sean. We still have to figure out a little bit of the how you will actually request them. But Recollection Wisconsin will be hosting those kits, and they'll be available to any institution basically in Wisconsin. Do we have any other questions? Okay, if not, that sort of brings us to the end of the webinar phase of our community archiving workshop training of the trainers. And our next meeting is in person, which is very exciting. Wednesday, July 24th at the UW-Madison Information School. So well, let's see, we have a few weeks until then. Yeah, just about 2 weeks. By the end of this week, I'll be sending everyone a more detailed itinerary. There is one on our community archiving website, which I think I've sent you all the link to, but there'll be a bit more detail. I'll also be sending you the confirmation numbers for the hotel rooms, which are all at the Fluno Center, and details for where to park with specific maps and things. The parking is underneath the Fluno Center, but there's a specific entrance you need to go into. So I'll send you all of that. And if you have any questions as you're getting ready in the next few weeks to come over to Madison, down to Madison, please be in touch. And let's see, I think that's all. Yeah, I'm just really excited to see everyone in person and get started on the next phase of our project.
Yeah, it's going to be really fun. I'm looking forward to it as well.
So I just, Annika and I want t-shirts that say "Tots" on them. Is that possible with the funding? I thought we would end it that way, because I feel like we're all tots, learning this process.
Oh, that's so great. I haven't thought about it that way.
Or a pin, like a pin, just so it would just be funny, because it would be, a memento of the whole experience.
I think I already have some stickers, but I think I might make another set of stickers with a tater tot theme.
Oh, I love that.
Because it's also very Wisconsin.
It so is Wisconsin. Yeah.
Oh, excellent. If anyone has really good design skills, please send me some mock-ups of a sticker.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'll get working on it.
That would be really fun. Good.
We have a button maker here in our library.
Oh my.
We could bring buttons.
Oh,
Ooh.
if you have room in your car, I think we could make time for a button making session.
I'm an experienced button maker.
Oh yeah, Annika is an experienced
From
button
college.
maker from college. So
Oh, wow.
anyway, we have skills. We all have hidden skills, right?
Yeah, and the workshop has a lot of built-in socializing time. Like we're going to be spending we'll eat a lot of our meals together and everything. So I'm really excited to just have a chance for us all to share our expertise on, whether it's like button making, tater tot ideas, collections expertise, etc. Like it's going to be really great.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
Great.
Well, thanks, everyone.
Yes, thank you all. It's been good sharing this morning with you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right. Bye. Thank you.
See you in a few weeks.
Okay. All right. Good.
This is geared more